The Industrial Revolution is a period that begins around about the 1750s and goes up until the 21st century. The Industrial Revolution is a period when there's a massive change in the way production of goods happens, right? So one of the things that is really most crucial about the Industrial Revolution is that we change from a period where muscle power and the use of animals or human power to move production has changed. And for the Industrial Revolution, it is a change to fossil fuel power or water power, but mostly fossil fuels, right? Coal and the production of steam. Now, the Industrial Revolution starts in Europe, and most importantly, it starts in Britain. Britain is particularly primed for the Industrial Revolution. First, Britain has a really great source of coal underneath its ground, right? Coal is a very useful resource. It can heat items, but more importantly than anything, it also can be used it's cheap to create steam power, which ultimately is the thing that leads to the power within the machinery in the factories. Along with that, you also have a series of laws in the 18th century that restricts poor people's access to land. And because of that, they can no longer farm. They then move into cities looking for jobs. So you have this sort of newly unemployed class who you can now bring to work in factories. Those are called the Enclosure Acts or the Enclosure Movement. Along with it, you also have a really great financial system. By the mid-1700s, Britain has a global empire, globally located in Canada. This is the mid-18th century, so before 1776. So the British have Canada, the 13 American colonies in the Caribbean. Britain has places in Africa, has parts of India. So parts of China. Britain has a massive empire. And the same financial institutions that need to exist to back a boat can be transitioned into backing the building of a factory. So the British are particularly primed. But it then spreads to the United States, it spreads to France, and ultimately by the mid-1800s to places like Germany, Czechoslovakia, Russia, Japan, and then in the 20th century to other places. The Industrial Revolution goes to the 21st century because I argue that one of the major features of the Industrial Revolution is technology replacing people's jobs. And we'll circle back to that in a little bit. Britain is also particularly primed because Britain has a tradition of sort of tinkering. Britain as a country, by the mid-18th century again, mid-1700s, has a tradition where people start to work and improve systems. So you have the Royal Society of London, founded in the 1600s, where papers are given about how to improve production on pieces. You have James Watt, a famous Scottish engineer, who winds up producing a condenser unit that makes the steam engine more efficient and smaller. You have James Hargrave, who helps invent the spinning jenny to make thread for your clothing a bit more efficiently. Henry Bessemer creates a way of making steel better. Eli Whitney is the outlier. Eli Whitney is an American who makes the cotton gin. And the cotton gin is a way, as the picture here shows, to extract the seed and process cotton a bit more efficiently. So the Industrial Revolution starts in Britain, as I say, and then spreads elsewhere. So some of the major changes that happen as a result of the Industrial Revolution are that there is a natural population increase. People move to cities, food sources get better, clothing gets better, so that people can start to survive past infancy and onward. Standard of living increases. More wages are available. People are living better lives. So the conditions under which people live are just better. Improved technology, I think I've covered, but the other two, though, that maybe don't make sense are urbanization and growing middle class. Urbanization is a big change here because people are moving into cities. People need to be close to their jobs, factories. When you are working on a farm or agriculture, the thing you need is space, you need land. But in factories, that's not the case, particularly once steel becomes a major thing, right? Because you can build up now. The middle class also becomes important, and it's tied to increased education, because now that you have a factory growing, you have people who need to manage the workers, right? And that becomes a management class, and that becomes a middle class. So there's a change in that respect. So a couple of other things that happen, right? Adam Smith, the famous Scottish philosopher, comes up with the idea of the factory system, or at least discusses the idea of the factory system. And bringing about division of labor so that we can take, the making of a pin, which is his example, and divide it into 20-something parts, and each person can do the different pieces of that construction. So we all become a specialist in one piece, right? It's a way to produce more goods. There's a change in time structure. We no longer focus on the time structure of the sun, or if we are in agriculture, when we decide to work. We now work on when the boss tells us to work, right? Whistle blows, we go to work. Whistle stops blowing, or whistle blows again, we end work. Even if we think about in terms of agriculture, right? There are certain ebbs and flows of your work year, right? You sow the seeds in the fall, in the spring. You tend the crops in the summer. You harvest the crops in the fall, and then in the winter you tend to the farm. You patch the barn up, you maybe take care of your cows, you sell your goods to market, you get ready for the next year. That's not the case in factory work, right? Factory work is a work that happens in these days, 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, 365 days a year. So there's a big change in that structure as well. As I said, urbanization changes. We move people into cities for that respect. The other piece to this is that there is steady pay. Farm pay is notoriously risky. There are years that you will do very well, and there are years that you will do very poorly. But steady pay for factory workers is a crucial piece to this, right? If you work 14 hours a day, you're going to get paid for 14 hours a day. The pay may be abysmal, the pay may be quite low, but you'll get paid for it nonetheless. The other major piece here is technological unemployment. People begin losing their jobs to factories, to technology. And the document that I'm going to ask you to look at is this document here, where it talks about this in fact, right? Talks about how there are thousands of petitioners thrown out of employ. There are scribbling machines that are taking all of these jobs away. One machine can do in 12 hours what it takes 8 men 24 hours to complete, right? The idea about how devastating new technologies are for the people of Europe, for the people of the world. And obviously that is still something that we struggle with today. The Industrial Revolution has some other major impacts to this as well. The working conditions that many people experience are quite atrocious. Young people, young children working in factories at devastatingly young ages, 5, 6, 7, 10, 12. They're working in extremely dirty conditions. These young men are breakers. They go down into coal mines. You can see that they're not wearing anything to cover their faces, so they're breathing in all this coal dust. So they're working in extremely difficult and extremely grueling conditions. Now, there are attempts at reform to try and make the lives of people better. So you have literature where people are trying to focus on the problems that people are experiencing. There are reform acts, things like the Reform Act in Britain of 1832 that sets different ages at which people can work. There's the Chartist movement, which is talked about in your book. The Chartist movement refers to the People's Charter, which was a series of demands that the Chartists, a group of people, wind up passing along to the British Parliament, sort of making demands about better representation, better treatment of workers and such. Overall, though, there are other movements, right? the union movement becomes important. And by the mid 1830s, in 1832, unions become legal, so that workers can come together, they can collectively bargain to try and make their own experience better. Those are political changes. You also have intellectual changes. So socialism becomes a major entity in the Industrial Revolution. Now, socialism had existed before. Socialism as an ideology is not new. It stretches back at least till Thomas More with Utopia in the 1500s. But you also have socialism emerging in the 1700s in France. A guy named Saint-Simon had come up with it. But socialism is the idea where, there's a lot of bad things that come along with socialism in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, and then obviously in the later 20th century. But socialism on its very face value is that if a society can provide for people to be very rich, there should be no reason for people to be very poor, and that the government should own the production so that people will not be exceptionally poor. Socialist projects pop up throughout Europe. One famous example is a guy named Robert Owen and his factory, linen factory at New Lanark in southern Scotland, where Robert Owen winds up creating a utopian society. If you work for the factory, if you work in the mill, if you work in the shops, if you work anywhere in the factory tending the sheep, whatever, you lived there in very nice apartments. So compared to, let's say, urban Glasgow or Edinburgh, who people might live in one-room apartments, Owen gave everybody multiple room apartments. He gave free education to children. The factory employed doctors, so everybody had health care. It was a way to say that if we can produce these goods, we are going to own the goods, but we're going to share the benefits to all. Now, that obviously gets a little bit more muddy when you get to people like Karl Marx, right? So in 1848, Karl Marx, and his companion Friedrich Engels wound up publishing the Communist Manifesto. Now, this idea is one where it changes from sort of the good side of socialism, where you have, providing the goods for everybody, equality. Karl Marx goes in the other direction, and this is revolutionary communism. The world is a struggle between the haves and the have-nots, and we need to overthrow the people who are the haves, the bourgeois, which is what this word is, and the proletariat, the working class. They must have, right? The last word of the the last words of the Communist Manifesto are, "Workers of the world, unite! You have nothing to lose but your chains." Marx was fascinated with the idea of the means of production, a term that was on the slide earlier. The means of production are the factories. They're the capital. They're their money. They're the things that help production happen. And for the bourgeois, the upper class, the owners, their money and their means of production make them more money. So they had X number of dollars. They bought a factory. The factory, their money continues to make money for them. For the workers, for the have-nots, all they have to do is sell their labor. That's everything that they can produce. So this is the difference that this is what Marx sees as the big problem. So the Industrial Revolution creates a lot of problems along with a lot of the successes, right? The Industrial Revolution does produce a lot of good things: better education, spreading better standards of living, urbanization in some respects. But it also has a lot of bad things. The environment has certainly suffered. Workers, in some places, workers are doing less well. Overall, the Industrial Revolution has a very mixed bag of results, but in my opinion, it's a net positive because people are living better, longer, and healthier lives.